All right, let's talk about the Titanic. But we're going to go way beyond the legend. We're going to break down the anatomy of this disaster and look at the chain of failures, the design flaws, the material weaknesses, and the human errors that led to one of the most infamous moments in history.
But first, let's just start with this one single chilling number. -2 degrees Celsius. That was the actual temperature of the North Atlantic Ocean on that night. And it's a critical place to start, because it meant that for anyone in the water, survival was going to be measured in just minutes.
So to really get why the disaster was so shocking, you have to understand the myth. You see, the Titanic wasn't just another ship. It was a full-blown symbol of modern engineering, of peak luxury, and this deeply held belief that it was invincible.
Yeah, she was one of 3 massive sister ships, and they were built to completely dominate the transatlantic route. Now, while their rivals were all busy chasing speed records, the White Star Line, they were selling something different: luxury and, above all, safety. And that marketing, plus the ship's sheer size, it created this powerful idea in everyone's minds that this thing literally could not sink.
Okay, so now let's dive into the very first link in that chain of failure. We're talking about the critical weaknesses that were forged right into the ship's structure long before it ever even touched the water.
Now here's something that might surprise you. The Titanic wasn't sunk by some single gigantic gash. Nope. Turns out, through metallurgical analysis, we know that many of the iron rivets holding the hull together, especially near the bow, they were lower quality. They were full of this stuff called slag. And in that freezing Atlantic water, they became incredibly brittle. So when the iceberg hit, they didn't bend, they just snapped. It was like a zipper coming undone, this chain reaction of tiny failures that unzipped the hull, plate by plate.
So the ship's main defense system was this: a series of 16 so-called watertight compartments. And the engineering behind it was pretty solid. The Titanic could stay afloat with any 2 of them flooded, and even with the first 4 completely full of water. I mean, on paper, this design made the ship seem basically unsinkable, but there was a critical, fatal flaw in how they were built.
And this right here perfectly shows that fatal flaw. You see, the watertight walls, they weren't sealed at the top. So as the first 6 compartments flooded, the sheer weight of all that water, thousands of tons of it, pulled the bow down. And that downward angle was all it took. The seawater just started to spill over the top of one wall into the next compartment, and then the next and the next. You know, just like filling an ice cube tray. From a physics standpoint, it was an unstoppable cascade that just doomed the ship from the inside out.
All right, so let's move to the next link in the chain. We've got this flawed giant of a ship. Now let's look at how a whole series of operational errors and some really unique weather conditions put it on a direct path to disaster.
So what you have here is basically a perfect storm of bad circumstances. First, the ship was just traveling way too fast for an area they knew was full of ice. Then you've got the lookouts, who were literally trying to spot icebergs with their naked eyes because their binoculars were locked away. And the final, ironic piece? The night was beautiful and eerily calm, which meant there were no waves breaking at the base of the iceberg to give away its position. It was basically a ghost.
And all of that brings us to the moment of impact. You know, the actual collision only lasted about 10 seconds. But a single decision made in that tiny window of time is what sealed the Titanic's fate.
Okay, this is going to sound completely backwards, but it's a shocking fact of naval engineering. The very move they made to try and save the ship is exactly what doomed it. By trying to steer around the iceberg, they got this long, scraping gash that breached 6 compartments. If they had just steamed straight ahead, the collision would have been violent for sure. It would have crumpled the front of the ship like an accordion. But all that damage would have been concentrated in just 1 or 2 compartments. It would have been a catastrophic event, but an entirely survivable one for a ship with that design.
So the collision was fatal for the ship, yeah. But the enormous loss of life? That was caused by the next chain of failures. An evacuation that was disorganized, totally inadequate, and just completely botched. I mean, just look at this chart. The math of the disaster is just stark and brutal. Even if the evacuation had gone perfectly, there were only enough lifeboats for about half the people on board. And what's truly shocking is that this was actually legal at the time. The safety regulations were so outdated, they based the number of lifeboats on a ship's weight, not how many people it could carry. But the crisis just got worse because of chaos. There was so much confusion, and a lot of passengers just didn't want to leave the quote-unquote unsinkable ship. So many lifeboats were launched half-empty. It's estimated that there were over 400 empty seats in the boats that rode away. Seats that could have saved 400 more lives.
And to make a totally desperate situation even worse, communication just failed on every single level. The closest ship, the SS Californian, was so near they could actually see the Titanic's lights, but their radio operator had already gone to bed for the night. And in the water, the lifeboats didn't go back for survivors, fearing they'd be swamped. The only ship that was coming to help, the Carpathia, it was just too far away.
So when you pull it all together, it becomes crystal clear. The sinking wasn't just about one unlucky moment. No, it was a devastating and frankly predictable cascade of errors, where every single failure just made the next one worse.
So here it is, the whole chain of failure, laid out bare. First, they were going too fast. Then, they made the wrong maneuver, which sealed the ship's fate. A fundamental design flaw made the sinking inevitable. An absolutely inadequate evacuation plan turned that sinking into a mass casualty event. And finally, a total failure of communication meant any real rescue was just too little, too late.
And this is maybe the most important takeaway of all. This disaster was not inevitable, not even close. It was the result of a system where every single layer of safety, from the rivets in the hull to the procedures on the bridge to the radio in the Marconi room, every single one failed in sequence. A single different decision at almost any one of those points could have completely rewritten history.
And that kind of leaves us with a final big question. You know, over a century later, the story of the Titanic is still the ultimate cautionary tale. It's this timeless warning about the dangers of overconfidence and a truly terrifying reminder of just how quickly our most complex and unbeatable systems can completely unravel.